Well, I think we'll get started, and I think we've got quite a few people in, 40 plus, 50 plus, so we'll get going. So
you're not going to share it on camera.
So can everyone please mute their microphones, and you can either and probably turn off your cameras, and gallery view is probably your best view to watch this. And so here we go. That was our housekeeping. So hello from Vancouver, Canada, and thank you all so very much for coming to this talk. During this time of world crisis, we are fortunate to be able, for a short while, to enter instead the timeless world of ceramics. And it is wonderful to have so many registrants from around the world together today. This lecture will be followed by a round of Q&A. So please use the chat room at the bottom of your Zoom window. Websites, email information, and everything will be found in the chat room, so you can continue to connect with people. The Northwest Ceramics Foundation acknowledges that the land on which we work is the unceded, shared traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations. The Northwest Ceramics Foundation has maintained their speaker series, lectures, which are lectures by established local and international artists and emerging artists since 2008. These have been free public lectures presented in the spirit of raising the level of discourse and awareness around the ceramic arts. This talk will be recorded, and it will be placed on our website by early March, and the website address will be in the chat room. Dr. Ronnie Watt is a collector and a specialist researcher of South African studio pottery and studio ceramic art. He is a graduate and a postgraduate of the University of South Africa. He wrote his master's dissertation, completed in 2017, on South African studio pottery of the later 20th century and its Anglo-Oriental epithet. The focus of his PhD, awarded in 2021, was a contextual history of South African ceramics of the 20th century and the 21st centuries, in which he positioned cultural and social political influences in the development of oeuvre and genres. He has published numerous articles on South African studio pottery. After retiring from his career as journalist and producer of television programs, he emigrated from South Africa to Canada in 2015 and is now resident in Nanaimo on Vancouver Island, where he continues his research. Dr. Watt's lecture, Reading a Negotiation and Expression of Identity in South African Ceramics, will address the expression of identity within a multicultural society, which has been a distinctive feature of South African ceramic art. This can be tracked in the earlier blatant appropriation of Indigenous culture during the apartheid era to the later considered blending of Western and African ceramic traditions in the years prior to and following the achievement of democracy in 1994. Because of time constraints and for the purpose of addressing a general audience, Ronnie will gloss over some academic concepts and condense significant histories. He will happily share resources for those who are wishing to gain deeper insights and consider academic arguments. And so he wants to keep chatting. His address will be provided at the end credits and is in the chat room. So now I will pass the Zoom over to Dr. Ronnie Watt.
Yeah. And hello, everyone. The slideshow is there.
Yeah.
My text is there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Share.
Yeah.
Great. Am I on camera?
Yeah.
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Sorry about this is the first time for me to present on Zoom, and I might not be very familiar with toggling between the camera and my text and the presentation. I'm going to take that away. Yeah. Okay. Welcome to everyone, and thank you for the invitation by the Northwest Ceramics Foundation of British Columbia, Canada, to present this talk. And before I talk about South African ceramic history, I have to give you a very brief introduction to the country, its peoples, and its cultures. And you will probably know all of these facts, but nevertheless, let's just recap. South Africa is a country with a landmass of some 1.2 million square kilometers. Now that's a bit less than 500,000 square miles at the southern tip of Africa. It has a multi-ethnic population of about 60 million, with nearly 8% of those being Black. That Black community itself made up of 4 major ethnic groups with several subgroups. The minority are the white, Indian, and colored communities, and a sprinkling of other ethnicities. Within the multi-ethnicity, there is also multiculturalism that references multiple other African and non-African cultures. It has a colonial and a post-colonial history that spans nearly 400 years, punctuated with eras of blatant racial and socio-political discrimination, notably that by the apartheid regime in the 20th century, which came to an end when a full democracy was achieved in 1994. My talk deals with expressions of identity in a multicultural society and the modes of negotiating and transmitting that. A number of concepts will arise: traditional and modernism, cultural appropriation and hybridity, African and Africaneity, and indigenous and indigeneity. I'm fully aware that we do not necessarily give the exact same semantic meanings and values to such expressions. In South African ceramics of the 20th and 21st centuries, there is ample evidence of an innovative blending of Western and African ceramic traditions, techniques, and materials. Now, admittedly, in the earlier years, it was for the sake of producing something novel that would appeal to the consumer and collector markets. But it progressively became driven by ceramists who interrogated issues such as place, tradition, culture, history, circumstance, relationship, and identity. Semi-industrial production pottery and studio pottery dominated South African ceramic production in the 2 decades after World War II. The favoring of Western-style ceramics was reflective of the character of the minority white South African society that enjoyed political, economic, social, and cultural domination under the apartheid policy of the nationalist government. In the shadow of that stood the traditional forms of pottery produced by the indigenous Black African cultures, which were then at best considered merely collectible ethnographic material culture. Let me elaborate on traditional pottery, that's quote unquote traditional, produced by the indigenous Black cultural groups. Such pottery making was assigned to women and were predominantly of a utilitarian nature, such as vessels for storage, serving, and brewing. These vessels were made for use within the homestead or to be traded within local community. Now, this is one such example. It's a traditional beer drinking vessel from the KwaZulu-Natal region in South Africa, dating to 1965. The name of the traditional potter is not known. It's in the collection of the Iziko museums of South Africa. A very early precedent by Black ceramists to produce works outside of cultural tradition, and specifically to appeal to white collectors, were the works of Samuel Makoanyane and Iziko Ntuli. The first 1909 to 1944, and Iziko 1912 to 1973. Makoanyane was a citizen of Lesotho. That's a country that shares a border with South Africa, but his works were predominantly sold in South Africa. Ntuli lived and worked in South Africa's KwaZulu-Natal province. Both were autodidacts, but they had access to European reference material. Both drew on those resources to produce highly realistic figurative works, a practice that fell well outside of their cultures. Here you see an example of the work of Makoanyane. He specialized in modeling people of the Basotho cultural group in a very small scale, and then added details fashioned from wood, metal, leather, and cloth. This is an example of the work of Iziko Ntuli. He produced figurines of wildlife and cattle and busts of men and women. Both produced works that would satisfy Western concepts of art and meet Western considerations of what constitutes African culture. And in that, they were guided by white sponsors and brokers. The Western perception of the other, meaning the non-Westerns, was embedded and transmitted in works produced by a number of South African production potteries. This is an example of a decorative plate produced by the Kalahari Ware Studio. It tapped into the demand for products that portrayed indigenous culture and social life. This romanticized or distorted imagery of native life was described by the art historian Winnie Gears as a preference for unspoiled tribal images, exotic, beautiful, naked or semi-naked black women, and crass sketches of African and pseudo-African culture. The designers showed a distinct lack of discretion in developing forms and decorations to reflect Africa and South Africa's indigenous cultures. Now, apart from the fact that works of this nature are guilty of mispresentations of indigenous cultures and lifestyles, they must also be judged in terms of cultural appropriation. Bear in mind this statement by James Young and Susan Haley, who wrote that outsiders cannot produce authentic expressions of insiders' cultures for the reason that insiders have privileged epistemic access to their culture. It's a sad reality that very thinly disguised cultural appropriation remains in evidence in contemporary South African ceramics, usually by commerce-driven studios and to appeal to a tourist market. And these tourist items show crude copies, as in the image, of the rock paintings of the Sand people, neither accurate nor in context. South African studio pottery, which gained its foothold in the 1950s and rapidly attracted a large number of practitioners and followers, called primarily on the ethics and to some degree on the aesthetics of the Anglo-Oriental tradition of studio pottery. The Anglo-Oriental tradition of studio pottery, I always try and put across as follows. It's a selection of mostly natural materials, forms to fit the purpose, the presence of the potter's hand in all of the procedures and processes, and the creation of a lifestyle around the rhythms of a working studio. Equally important were the influences of English country pottery and the Scandinavian and Japanese schools of pottery, on which the early studio potters called. Some of those studio potters alluded to their association of the country through the use of colors, textures, and imagery of indigenous fauna and flora. Here's an example of the work by Asias Bosch, one of the pioneers of South African studio pottery. Next, a vessel by Brian Hayden, who's also considered to rank amongst the studio pottery pioneers. This is an example of a work by Steve Shapiro of the second generation of South African studio potters. Now, contemporaneous with the early development of studio pottery by white South Africans, a group of black women who were skilled in the hand-making of traditional vessels in the idiom of their Zulu and Sotho cultures were recruited by the evangelical Lutheran church's art and craft studios at Rookstrik in KwaZulu-Natal province. They were guided by Nordic instructors, and the women made use of Western technology and materials to produce wares that would appeal to a Western market. Here's an example. The wares straddled the forms of familiar Western-style studio pottery and the traditional pottery of Zulu cultures, as in this example. Now, the Rookstrik pottery quickly attracted the attention of collectors both within and outside of South Africa, and gained further status when the Durban Art Gallery acquired a number of works in 1968 for its permanent public collection. That was a significant moment. It was done in defiance of a separatist apartheid policy imposed on South Africa, and it also elevated Black pottery out of the ethnographic into the public, into the contemporary art collections of South Africa. The ceramic artists who came to the fore in the late 1970s in South Africa, and the majority of them white, many trained at tertiary level, abandoned Western convention and purpose. As to the reason for that, the South African artist and art critic Andrew Foster posed a question. Though through all our art has been a thread that has troubled people to a greater or lesser extent, one of belonging. Where do we as artists fit into Africa? How to prove our credentials? How do we resolve the dilemma of being Western and African at the same time? Authenticity is everything, but identity has been elusive, is elusive, and cannot be invented. The secret is in the way the ideas are used. The secret lies in the imagination of the artist. The opportunity and means to exercise imagination came in the shape of the vessel. The vessel is not bound to any traditions or conventions, whether in form, decoration, or purpose associated with the pot. It serves as a metaphor for the pot and assumes a function of being a container for concepts. And in that sense, it permitted South African ceramists to explore and express an alterity to their associated identities. And in this, hybridity became a key feature. John Scott defines hybridity as a positive condition of cultural change and creativity that has attempted to challenge fixed or sensualist accounts of identity and culture. Marvin Crady has a concern that hybridity must not be a merely descriptive device, but must be approached as a communicative practice and a space through which interactions of differential powers are continuously negotiated. Frank Vigneron holds a similar view to Crady by stating that hybridity is not inherent in the object itself, but is subject to who perceives it and from what point of view. Now, on the part of the white ceramist, I will illustrate this by referring to the oeuvres of Maggie Mikula, Michelle Legge, and Kim Sachs. They call in a very judicious manner on the physical and symbolic features of traditional pottery, but more importantly, also the cultural and social political context of pottery production and usage. They adopt method, material, form, and decoration to convey a relevance and meaning, or to make statements of identity, to deliver commentary on issues ranging from social to environmental concerns. The features associated with the pottery of indigenous cultures are represented by them in familiar, subtle, or exaggerated forms and with differing intents. This is the work of Maggie. She hailed from a family very steeped in association with the Zulu community and culture. traveled extensively in Africa and outside of Africa to learn about traditional material culture. In the early 1980s, her vessels started to show evidence of cross-cultural referencing, in which she recorded and interpreted iconography and cultural materials. This included African drums, Yoruba weaving of Nigeria, Fulani weaving of Western Africa, neck rings of various African cultures, and Zulu earplugs, headdress, and pottery. In a radical break of ceramics tradition and convention, she incorporated non-ceramic materials such as threads, metal, and shells in her vessels, further decorating them with sgraffito, inlaid and painted slips and oxides, so that she could achieve her desired form and the design of pattern, color, and texture. But these works, when compared in size with traditional vessels, were very, very small. This is a more explicit allusion to Zulu culture and can be seen in the work of the ceramist Michelle Lake. She produced a series which she titled Woman Warrior, and in that she examined the character and roles assigned to women, such as fragility, caregiving, and the provider of sustenance, and she opted to reference traditional Zulu vessels for her own forms. Some traditional Zulu forms are decorated with raised conical nodules called amasumpa, normally arranged in low relief in a very geometric pattern. Now, these forms were dramatically enhanced by Lake with aggressive and even menacing spike-like decorative features, so to stand guard and to protect the essence of womanhood. This is the work of a ceramist, Kim Sachs. She trained in South Africa and Denmark and traveled extensively to explore different ceramic practices and folk art of the Middle East, North and South America, and Africa. Her work presents a synthesis of elements of the Danish and African ceramic traditions to express a layered identity. The vessels recall the texture of Africa, but they also serve to cradle the ethos of Africa, which, according to Sachs, reflects her as being of the place and in tune with the drum beating in Africa. Next, an introduction to the work of two contemporary Black ceramists, Sibonelo Taule-Thuli and Andile Dealbane. In 2015, Sibonelo presented his first solo exhibition, Song of the Soil, and that raised the bar for the revisioning of traditional ceramic forms and how those forms engage with the metaphysical, the ideological, and the material. On the one hand, the vessels reflect how he defines himself as belonging to South Africa's Nguni culture, and on the other hand, how he situates himself in the broader South African society. The Thuli reimagines traditional forms and alters the shape and the size to make them, in fact, meaningless as utilitarian vessels. Now, the surface decoration can be a play on traditional geometric patterns, or in a clear break with tradition, introduce drawings, writings, and marks of a personal iconography. In another deviation from tradition and to serve as social commentary, he names her vessels quite provocatively with titles such as Miseducation, Blacked Out Through Whitewash, and Stolen Legacy. Andile Dealbane found a visual vocabulary in ceramics for the narratives of his Xhosa ancestry and heritage, as well as for making statements about his own identity. And he was born in a rural community in the Eastern Cape province of South Africa, but his studio now is based in metropolitan Cape Town. His works encapsulate and express an urban persona in the context of a past and present indigenous cultural history. These works translate African tradition, belief, practice, a material culture in design concepts that appeal to an international audience, and of course to a South African audience. Andile works in an urban design idiom in which tradition is balanced with contemporary expectations of aesthetics. He describes this practice as meditation, mediation, translation, and communion. This can be explained when we look at one of the forms that form part of his Idonga collection. The Xhosa word Idonga refers to a form of soil erosion. Translated into this vessel, it evokes Andile's childhood memory of sliding down the slopes of dongas to collect clay whilst he was tending his father's cattle. The form of the vessel resembles a slippery slope, with a neck also recalling a cattle hoof print impressed in mud. The upper part of the vessel is decorated with faint lines to evoke scarification, and a multitude of letters lower down that do not spell out any word. The letters were created using the keys of a vintage typewriter, which he found at a flea market in an urban setting. As seen in its whole, the vessel records an African legacy, dark, textured earth, scarification, but it's also emerging with the modern and the other, the Western technology and the Roman lettering. It also positions Andile as having to negotiate a firm foothold somewhere between the past, tradition, and the present, innovation. In these examples, I have shown works that originate in a bona fide familiarity and understanding of African cultures and the African ethos. The ceramists have settled into the new South Africa and shifted from expressions of me and my world to me in the world. They address their own and universal issues, such as human rights, population growth, political suppression, violence against women, gender discrimination, and environmental concerns. And where they reference indigenous culture, it is typically so subtle and transformed to the point of being cryptic, so that only if you are informed will you be able to establish a direct link. And this can especially be seen in the work of a ceramist, Ian Garrett. Ian studied traditional Zulu ceramics for his Master of Arts in Fine Arts degree, and was in fact taught some of those skills by Nestor Nala, the most prominent of contemporary Zulu potters at the turn of the century. This is one of, sorry, the other way. This is one of Nestor's vessels in a private collection in South Africa. Ian rejects the perception that African ceramics are ethnically inclusive. In fact, his works challenge assumptions about race, culture, and national identity. As in this vessel, it is reminiscent of the forms of traditional vessels, but he puts a new spin on it with his rhythmical pattern repetition. Now, the patterns are cryptic references to various ancient or contemporary cultures and the natural environment. The references and meanings which he calls on have grown to be so subtle as to be ambiguous, even elusive, and it leaves space for the viewer to find an own interpretation and meaning. Now, I have discussed and illustrated how the South African ceramists of the 20th and the 21st centuries have negotiated and continue to negotiate identity. I'm not speaking of identity as a vested claim in citizenship of a country. In my personal view, identity is significantly shaped by how we position ourselves in our own immediate world and within the greater world. Identity shapes the lens through which we see, and it shapes the lens through which we are seen. To communicate identity, the South African ceramists have a liberty to call on familiar cultural references and to build on or break with tradition and convention. This is important because with that comes a great responsibility to be judicious and respectful in what and how you reference. And they will be judged by those ethics more so than by the aesthetics of their work. Just to repeat that last line. They will be judged by the ethics, not by the aesthetics of their work. Thank you. And thank you, Deborah.
He's finished. Yeah. Okay. So now have you passed the host to me, Ronnie?
Yes, I have.
Okay. So what we've got so far, we've got one question from Amy Gugarty, who wanted to know what was written on the pot by Tau. I can't probably say it properly. Taulith.
The Tuli.
Yes. Could you discuss the text on that pot?
Yeah, it's a letter in isiZulu, the Zulu language, written to his father. Yeah.
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 And what is the and Amy was also
thank you, Esther, for providing that information. Esther Esmiel of the Iziko Museum in South Africa. It's a letter in isiZulu, the Zulu language, and it's written to his father, explaining his calling to work as a ceramic artist.
okay. And at this point, does anybody else have any other questions that they'd like to address to Ronnie, particularly about ideas of identity, I would think, and perhaps some parallels with the countries that you live in. So is there anything else anyone wants to say? Hopefully you unmute yourselves, and perhaps you can even wave your hands and stop, open up your videos, and you can perhaps even address Ronnie directly.
If Anne Marais in South Africa is still with us, perhaps she can just join us, and Anne can make a very valuable contribution to
Thank you, Ronnie. Can you hear me?
Yes, Anne,
Yes.
hello.
Hello, hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you
Can you
very
hear
well.
me? Okay, hello, Ronnie. Nice to talk to you.
And won't you just Anne herself is a ceramist and has referenced African material culture. Perhaps just very briefly, and just explain how you incorporate those references in your work.
Ronnie, I don't at present. I did long ago.
Yes, that's correct.
I want to talk to you strongly about it, but long ago, when I left Cape Town, I went to the Eastern Cape, and I became deeply immersed in the local population, and I began to draw. I had a very Eurocentric education. I learned nothing about Africa, and I lived in Africa. And suddenly I was confronted by this extraordinary wealth, unbelievable wealth of art in Africa. And I was very drawn to it for about 15 years. It's a long story. I won't go into it now. I have changed dramatically, but I won't go into that. What I would like to say is, first of all, thank you for that summation. I thought it was absolutely excellent what you said, and I endorse everything you said. It is really, really helpful, and I would really love to have a translation of it. But what I feel, I particularly feel very drawn to the work of Andile, because I feel that he is retranslating and moving Iziko culture into the 21st century in a very meaningful and unique way, and extraordinarily exciting. He is really an icon, and I think he's extraordinarily important and significant in South African art, not just South African ceramics. And I'm really grateful to him for what he's doing to resurrect into prominence African art as it should be, as it should take its place in world art. And he is one of the forerunners, and I think is very, very significant. And I'm very glad that we have him.
Great. Thanks, and I should encourage anyone joining this discussion just to go Google Andile de Albane and have a look at his work. At the same time, ceramists like Sponelo Tolutuli as well. Is Wendy Geers still with us? Wendy? Is Wendy with us? Wendy Geers did an intensive study and an acclaimed study of South African studio pottery. And of particular interest would be to hear her input on cultural appropriation in South African production pottery in the early and mid second part of the previous century. Amy, you had a question, talk about the status of studio pottery in South Africa or about education in ceramics.
Yes, I did have that question, but I see Wendy is with us, so maybe she could talk first.
Wendy?
She's muted. There.
Is it possible to communicate with her?
For some reason, we're not hearing her. I don't know, maybe join with audio? Well, it sounds like she's not able to comment. So maybe you could talk a little bit about education in ceramics in South Africa and the status with which studio pottery is held. Is it, considered in the fine art or?
And the answer is sadly not anymore, not at tertiary level. Up till early in this century, there were still tertiary qualifications that could be achieved in ceramics. Studio pottery in the previous century, 1960s, 70s, that, there's Wendy. Wendy, are you with us?
I hope so. Can you hear me now?
Hi, Wendy. This is Wendy Geers, one of the most acclaimed South African and international ceramic art historians. Wendy, I referenced the Kalahari wares and the visual presentations of African life or cultural life. Would you say that was cultural appropriation?
Absolutely, Ronnie, I would. But I'm also very concerned. I think your presentation was wonderful and congratulations. And thank you very much for honoring my work. And certainly I've been hugely inspired by colleagues like yourself. And it's wonderful to see your work and Anne's work and other colleagues who are taking up the mantle of thinking through recent and contemporary Southern African ceramics. There's a real dearth of scholarship, and thank you Northwest Ceramics Foundation for hosting this talk. I think there are probably a lot of parallels within Canadian studio ceramics from the early 20th century to present. Ronnie, I loved your presentation and thank you for sharing everything. I would agree that cultural appropriation is obviously problematic. You quoted me, and I was a very critical young scholar when I wrote those words, and perhaps I think that those were probably written about 10 years ago. My position as a scholar hasn't changed, but perhaps my interests have slightly moved on. And while I was a very angry young scholar, and quite rightfully so, seeing a lot in my studies and my research into Southern African ceramics, seeing the degree of financial exploitation, the complete lack of occupational health and security norms for Black artists and artisans, the vast number of potters dying of industry-related illnesses that they should not be dying of, elderly men and women, Black men and women who were simply discarded by industry. And when I say industry, I also mean artisanal and small commercial potteries. They were just disposable. So yeah, I think there were like when I wrote, I was quite shocked by findings in surveying the South African ceramics scene, and those that my criticism still holds. But now I sort of feel when I look back, and when I specifically look at contemporary ceramics scene, I would like us to say that we have moved into a new era, and an era that is a challenging era in so many ways, economically and politically. But I would love us to be less moralistic in our judgments, and hope that we can engage on new terms that are less racially I think well, it's difficult because one really wants to encourage diversity and inclusion, but at the same time, there are these kind of strong racial coloration that still exists, and I don't know how one moves beyond that, and I'd love us to move beyond that. So I think that's my comment, and I'm sorry if that's a very long-winded way of commenting.
But I think what is valid here is in describing your own change of mind, about your progression over the years. And if you reflect back on what you wrote 10 years ago and your viewpoint now, and isn't that the fantastic thing about looking at ceramics of an earlier era, and the way it was perceived and received then, and the way that it is received now. And it could be so different. At the same time, the way that I would receive a contemporary work by Andile here is received completely differently elsewhere. So and this is the thing what I say, that the referencing being done by South African ceramists of whether it be a South African indigenous culture or an African culture or any other culture, it can be so subtle and so sublime that you have to be informed to be able to understand where it comes from. And at the same time, it's not a case of just borrowing a visual element or a design element. That becomes the vehicle to convey a meaning, a message, a concept, an idea. And when hybridity, I think, has for many people a negative connotation. Yes, it would be negative if it's nothing but a bricolage. Take a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and let's make something totally new. But that is not what hybridity is. Hybridity is a communicative process. By using or referencing something of yours, this is a communication. This is how I relate to you or how you relate to me. And again, that same object presented to someone totally in a different context, that would, different meanings would be assigned to it. I think that's the magic of ceramics. So it's not a given thing. A ceramic work is not an object, it's a subject. It has.
So you're saying it's culturally nuanced, and I would certainly agree with you and say that that is the job of an art historian, and the importance of teasing out those nuances. Yes. And that your contribution is so valued and valuable because we have so few art historians who are prepared to give these quite difficult subjects that time to deep, you know, to dive really deep and tease out that complexity.
Yeah, but in teasing it out, it can be very contentious. If I talk about indigenous and indigeneity in the context of South Africa, those same concepts treated in Canada, in a Canadian society, would be very, very different. And I'd love some of the Canadians to talk about this. Indigenous, indigeneity. Is there anyone who would like to join us and talk about that? Thanks, Wendy. Nice to see you.
I'll say something later too, Ronnie, if I may.
Yeah. Okay.
I can,
After
go ahead.
Deborah, yeah, can you invite perhaps some of the Canadians? Because although there's so many similarities between the two societies, multicultural, multi-ethnic, but the way that we would approach it in South Africa is not necessarily the same as how Canadians would do it. How to be indigenous in Canada, I think there are different values to being indigenous in South Africa. Indigeneity meaning to belong to, not necessarily to be. Difference there, but it's semantics. But I would like to get input from the Canadians.
I can talk a little bit about that. Recently, there was an exhibit put up in the Museum of Anthropology, and included in the exhibition was work by a man named David Lambert. And David Lambert was working in the 50s and 60s, and he was a white artist. And first, you have to understand that Indigenous people in Western Canada and probably Western United States did not use clay as a form of expression. They never used it. They used wood. They were masters of wood. Clay was not used. So the use of ceramics only came to Western Canada through immigration. And so David Lambert was an immigrant. I think he was an Englishman, I can't remember, or maybe not. But anyways, what he did was he approached in the 50s, 1950s, 1960s, he approached and was friends with Indigenous people. He asked permission to use some of their patterns and their form line and the meanings. And what was so interesting is they gave it and they explained it to him, and he used it on his pottery. It became very commercially successful at the time. And so in this exhibition that was in 2021, Carol Mayer, the curator, included his work as part of the story. And there was a lot of dismay that his work, because people felt he had appropriated the work. And at the time and in that context, he had asked permission. And he felt he was contributing to Indigenous history and contributing to knowledge. But in the 2021 context, this was viewed negatively by a lot of people who came to the exhibition. And so it is a very sensitive point. I don't think we've evolved in our relationships at this point. They are too fraught, and there's too much sorrow and too much difficulty. And I don't think we've evolved in our relationships. And what's happened historically, especially recently, so much coming to light, that we can have this conversation yet. And yet I think it's a very important conversation. But I think it has to happen. And it would only enrich everybody if it does. I mean, Bill Reed, in a sense, one of our most famous Indigenous artists, he was part German and part Haida. And he was one of the first Indigenous artists to try and make this bridge. Charles Endenshaw, who was a much earlier artist in the early turn of the century, he also tried to make some bridges. But recently, it's very difficult.
Just tying up to that, even as a ceramics art historian and writing and talking about works produced by members of the Black community in South Africa is, I find sometimes problematic, because I have to try and share something that I have learned, but what I've learned is so limited. Whereas an academic like Elizabeth Ferrell in the United States is steeped in Zulu culture and so familiar with it and can write with such authority about it. Whereas at the times for myself, I am familiar, but I do not have in-depth knowledge. That is a field of study all on its own. It would take many lifetimes for me to be able to master it. But at the same time, so to negotiate is you have to negotiate your way through, as a ceramics art historian, what I see, what I perceive, what I know as fact. But at the same time, this is a communicative process. So I see something, it communicates with me. It will communicate with you in a different way. But at least there's some basics that everyone can share in.
Ronnie, can I say something?
Yes.
I really like what you just said. I think we can identify exactly what you said here in South Africa, what you said is going on in Canada. But what I feel about hybridity is a very, very interesting subject. I did an exhibition last year called Fragmented Narratives. And when I began to examine this, I realized how fragmented all our lives are and have been for all of history. And it's the same with hybridity. It's a very exciting time. I think we have to feel our way. We are all, in this country, we are multicultural in a good sense in many ways, particularly creatively. There's a very open field. And we must just realize that it's going to take time. And we're not all going to come to one particular type of expression, because we're all different. And we acknowledge that difference and we go along with each other and we will learn and we will develop. And it's really, really exciting what's happening, that there's this freedom to express yourself. I feel very, very deeply about redressing the past colonial repression of all Africa's artistic history. I feel very deeply about that. And I really am so delighted, as I said, with somebody like Andile. But that is just one aspect. We are all different. We, as you were saying, Ronnie, we look at things differently. And we must be allowed that space and to make mistakes, to carry on, and to have a very broad and rich culture that encompasses many, many aspects, not just one. And I think it's exciting. And I think we must encourage it. We must go with it. We must promote it. We must understand it. We must be sympathetic. That's what I feel.
Great. So just back to hybridity again. In African modernism, hybridity is a key feature of African modernism. And in that sense, hybridity is used to contest binaries, you, me, tradition, modernity. In African modernism, hybridity is a means to post-colonial interrogation. And this was African modernism arose in Western Africa amongst Black communities and Black artists, and including Black ceramists, and expanded into a wider area of Africa. Now in South Africa, by comparison, hybridity was initially practiced by white ceramists. But can we say, if you bring the post-colonial debate in, how do you justify white South Africans calling a hybridity to produce works? If you look at African modernism, it arose in a Black community, in a Black ethos. But here you have in South Africa, in Africa, white ceramists also practicing hybridity. And I think that's a question of, it's an ethics. And I'm not going to debate that now. Personally, I believe it is permitted. I have no problem with that, because it is being done judiciously, respectfully, out of understanding, out of empathy, to communicate. It is not taking something from someone to make my own. In fact, if that makes sense to you, and you agree there, it's communicating. Hybridity is communication.
We're all hybrids. We're all mongrels. I'm a mongrel. You're a mongrel. We're all mongrels. Not just one thing. We are a bit African. We're a bit this. We're a bit European. We're a bit international. We're not just one thing. None of us are.
Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
very few people are.
Deborah?
Can I say something too?
Yes, Amy.
I think the whole issue really comes down to power. It's great to say we're all hybrid. It's great to say we're all mixtures, but who is in charge of museums? Who is in charge of politics? Who is in charge? Whose work is being shown? Whose work is being collected? Whose work is being written about? And until there is some level of equality there, I really can't claim that because I'm hybrid, I have just as much right to have access to those languages. I think we, at least certainly in Canada, it is so fraught. It is so, the pain has been so deep that in order to be respectful, I have to stand back. That's the only way I can be respectful. And I think hybridity shows itself here in many other ways, as certainly in terms of gender, in terms of, say, transgender issues, or feminism, or in terms of materiality. But I think we all arrive at that area where if we are imposing on other cultural property that is, it's like Aboriginal people say, you've taken everything from me and now you want my culture. It's just not fair. And I think we have to be very, very careful about saying, I'm respectfully stealing your culture. It doesn't work.
But this makes it important that that we don't, and I said it earlier, that we don't look at ceramic works as objects, but as subjects. So what do they teach us? Another thing that I believe in, and that is that ceramic work is an entangled narrative. And within that narrative, you have views from extreme sides, as well as the middle ground. And that bothers me about when works are displayed in exhibitions, and they would always put up the work and the name and the date and the materials, but that doesn't give me the context of it. And the same would apply especially in Canada and in South Africa, anywhere in the world for that matter, is what does it say? It's not just the aesthetics. Stop treating ceramic works or any other works as objects. They are subjects. They are meant for us to start thinking, to start debating, to create communication between me and the maker, me and the vessel, me and someone else receiving or perceiving that. That's the magic, isn't it?
Ronnie, can I say something again?
Yeah.
Am I muted? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Amy, I fully endorse what you're saying, and I think you're totally correct. But I will say in South Africa that as of now, to redress what has been done through colonialism will take too many lifetimes. Certainly not in my life will it be redressed properly. But at the moment, as far as I'm concerned, and perhaps Ronnie can either endorse or disagree with me, there is no discrimination whatsoever in terms of race. We don't think in terms of race. I'm not involved in this debate at all. My field now is totally environmental in my work. That's my most concern right now, and has been for the last 4 years. But I feel, and perhaps Ronnie will agree with me or not, that there is complete freedom. Appropriation is not something that one can possibly endorse. I think more it's an exploration. You do have cliques of people who are still very Eurocentric. You have a whole spectrum across the board. But the greatest energy is coming from Black artists like Andile and like Madodo Fani, who makes the most extraordinary, wonderful, meaningful work that are Pan-African. And they are actually at the forefront of ceramics in South Africa amongst important collectors and dealers. Though I will say, and this is something I've wanted for a long time, that I really, really want there to be major art galleries in the major centers of Black art, which is places like Soweto in Johannesburg, outside Johannesburg. That's what we need, the promotion of indigenous gallery owners and promoters. I don't know what you feel about that, Ronnie.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I see Kim Sachs is also there. Kim, hello. Good to see you.
Ronnie.
Wouldn't you like
I got
to...
a message from Leanne. It's very nice to be here. Oh, I'm listening with lots of ears.
I don't just want
nice
you to listen.
See you. I'm listening.
Please give us some of your input. I mean, I discussed your work in such a nutshell.
I'm sorry I missed the discussion on my work. Leander Walford messaged me and said, have you heard what they're saying? I thought I better listen.
I lavish praise on your work, Kim.
That's very kind, Ronnie.
Kim, for the rest of the audience, is one of the leading ceramists, but not only a ceramist, but also a gallery owner and a teacher. And Kim, we were talking about how, especially in your work, it comes out for me so strongly in your work that the references to Africa or African cultures is so finely spun through it that if I presented it to anyone who has no familiarity of Africa, they might not even be able to guess the origin of it. So I was talking about in the way that South African ceramists reference other cultures, that it's done so judiciously and responsibly that it's not blatant, it's not in your face. There goes a lot of thinking into referencing another culture. You do that.
You know, I think having lived all over the world and feeling very much that I'm an African, I think there's so many levels to this. And having grown up in South Africa and then having studied in Scandinavia and then returning to South Africa, we inculcate so much, you know, and my work in the 80s was produced in or published in a book on Pan-African art by Matsimela Manaka. And it caused an absolute fury. He was furious because he didn't know who I was, and he saw some of my work and photographed it. And I absolutely messed with his book because he took my work. He thought I was an African and didn't bother to find out more about me. And here I was, this mad Jewish African mama who, you know, and he wouldn't come and meet me for years because he published this whole book and my work had gone against and kind of messed with the whole thing. And I feel that, you know, it is a very complex debate, but I feel, and there's so many levels to this, it's a conversation for many months. I live in the epicenter of this. You know, I taught my daughter. He came to me to learn. I've been involved in layers and layers of our movement of curating, of collecting. So I don't even know if I I think I've got a very skewed sense of things. Maybe I'm the wrong person to ask, but I'm definitely I opened a new ceramic center in the last 2 weeks. So I'm kind of experiencing a tsunami. There's such a wave of extraordinariness happening in our country at the moment, but there's my kind of sense is to get a gallery like Anne alluded to in Soweto makes me kind of giggle slightly, because you've got to be mad to have a gallery of anything, in fact, these days. And
yeah. So,
you know,
and she's not giggling at you, but she's giggling at the concept of owning a gallery in
fond
South
of it.
Africa at the
Yeah,
moment.
no, I mean, it's you've got to be, people come in and they say, how did you survive COVID? To have a gallery full stop these days and promote ceramics in most countries is you've got to be nuts.
Okay. Thanks, Kim.
I'm not being very helpful, but it's a very complex issue.
But I'm happy
Yeah.
that you joined the group and happy that I
I'm
could have
thrilled.
introduced you to
Thank
Canadians
you, Ronnie.
and anyone else there. Wendy, can I come back to you just as a ceramics art historian and taking into account what Amy said, and we respond with emotion to certain critical concepts. So as ceramic art historians, how do we navigate that? How?
Can I take a step back before I
Yeah.
respond to that?
Yeah.
Amy, I certainly agree with what you said, and for a very long time, those power relations and the fraughtness was equal to that of Canada within South Africa, and the question of speaking for the other is still 100% valid and still a huge moral and ethical question. As how, and I'm not going to address that. Well, maybe I'll address it sideways or obliquely, but I want to take a step back and just say that the big difference between South Africa and Canada in terms of those power relations is that South Africa has a Black population. Well, South Africa has a population of 47.4 million people, of which 81% are Black people. So the population statistics are massively different. The majority are Black people and white people are a very small minority. And so those questions of power, now that that power has been changed, does bring about a new way of questioning what is being produced, because the majority, the rightful majority who are Black or Indigenous, and Black is not Indigenous, just as a clarification, there are sort of degrees of indigeneity as well. Those power relations are very different. And so I think hybridity is looked through a slightly different lens, and I'm going to use quite crass metaphors, but there's the sort of metaphor of the melting pot, where and sort of the metaphor of the salad bowl and the metaphor of the kaleidoscope. And certainly I think both countries, or for a long time, both Canada and South Africa tried the melting pot method of sort of multiculturalism and pretending that cultural differences and economic relations didn't prevail. Those can no longer be overlooked. And certainly within South Africa, economic upliftment is not universal and not perfect, but it does exist, and there are superstar Black artists. And Andile Dielvani, for example, is the living embodiment of a hugely commercially and professionally and aesthetically successful Black artist who is showing with blue chip galleries. He shows with Bender Friedman in New York, who is the leading craft and design gallery. He's at Miami Basel for many, many years running. He is like, he is blue chip as blue chip gets. There's very few ceramic artists in any country of his status. And it's, I think it's a celebration. It's a huge celebration that in a relatively short time, South Africa's managed to make that transition and have blue chip Black artists who stand there on the merit and integrity of their own work. So there are kind of differences, and I hope that answers or speaks to some of those power issues. And I also don't want to sweep them under the table, because it's not perfect. South Africa's like such a long way away from having total economic and cultural redress. It's a work in progress. And certainly within Canada, we see celebrated Indigenous artists as well, but they remain a minority, and their disenfranchisement is still a huge reality. And I totally agree with you that it is far more fraught within Canada than it is within South Africa, and that those facts need to be recognized.
I think what you said about the population demographics is really important, because certainly Aboriginal people, I don't know, are what, maybe 5%, Deb, do you think?
I think it is 5%. So it's just such an unfair.
It's yeah. I mean, there's really large urban populations of Aboriginal people in a number of cities, but overall, and in terms of numbers of, we've had the first Governor General who was an Aboriginal woman, an Inuit woman, and that's the first in like how many years. And I think also there's the very interesting dynamics between Canada, where Indigenous for us very definitely means First Nations, Métis, Inuit, as opposed to Black, and then being next door to the United States, where issues of Black and white are very, very fraught. And of course, over the last 2 years have become more so, because the Black people, for the most part, have got the history of having come from an enslaved ancestry, and that institution of slavery is so powerful and so determining. So I think what you've really both brought up, or all of you have brought up so well, is that every culture is unique and different, and we can't make generalizations that go across. So I really appreciate you bringing up the demographics, because that is a really big difference as Black people in South Africa take a much more rightful place in government and in institutions, and that's still a long ways off for here.
Okay, but as Wendy said, and I'm not going to delve into this issue at all, that Black South Africans, some would say that they are not First Nation. I mean, it's extremely contentious. I'm not going to even venture there. So. Well,
in Canada,
I will give a summary, Ronnie, if you want. I mean, just Black people arrived at the same time as white. A lot of Black people arrived at the same time as white people, coming from the north, coming from Congo. There were successive waves of migration of Bantu-speaking language groups that came from the north, and there were civilizations in Zimbabwe and other regions, but there were significant migrations from the north and the west of Africa, sort of north and the northwest and northeast, coming downwards to the Cape, that came around similar times as white settlers. The indigenous people, the Khoi, the San, and are very different physiologically and biologically to Black people,
and culturally,
and culturally and linguistically and
but at the
religiously.
Same time,
yes, it is slightly different, but yes, Black people,
We're not going to go into the politics, not in this discussion.
No, but just to clarify that point, so that there's a sense that what it means to be Indigenous in South Africa is contested, and Black is not a homogenous group.
Right, very important. Okay, so just to come back to the South African ceramics of South Africa, and I think this is a message that I really want to convey, and that is that what does it teach me, and what could it teach you? That is that it's a process. It's communicative. It communicates. It invites debate, different opinions, different perspectives. And from my context and your context. So as a ceramics art historian, that is interesting for me, is how this object becomes a subject perceived by you in one way and by me in a different way. And there doesn't have to be a meeting ground for that. It's academically speaking, the various poles of the debate are of interest to me. And I need to know more about Canadian ceramics as well in the context of indigeneity. Is it Canada? Is it Canadian? Those same questions are being asked in South Africa as well. As Wendy also said, there's this lack of academic research into South African ceramics, a lack of authoritative publications. It's not being taught, ceramics is not being taught at tertiary institutions anymore, not as many as in the past. There's the Art Technical College that would teach that. And I think that's very, very sad for South Africa. It's one thing to just go on making pots and vessels and ceramic sculptures, but something is going lost in it if we cannot learn from the ceramist, record it, document it, preserve it, share it. And that, I hope that's not the case in Canada. I think you have some great ceramic art historians based in Canada. We must guard against it, not only to make pots, but also to talk about pots.
Yeah, we've been, some of the institutions in Canada have gone, but some have maintained themselves. It has been sort of a struggle to keep ceramics in the institutions. And we're only sort of very slowly acquiring writers. I remember being at a conference in England, they were saying the most important thing that we can all do, you know, as communities, is to start writing about ceramics, and or have people come to ceramics and write about it in an informed way.
Yep.
But we have been maintaining.
I see that Wade has got his wants to ask a question. Wade.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. So I lived in Mozambique for a few years, and
hello.
But I'm Canadian. I'm actually currently in Oakville. I'm attending Sheridan College in the ceramics department, if anybody has. Yeah. So while I was in Maputo, one of the things that I did is I have a very understanding husband, and he encourages me. We traveled through Eswatini and South Africa, and one of the things that I found was I didn't have a lot of options for publications to read about either Mozambican artists, even though I found a publication about Renata Sedimba, and I found a few exhibitions by João Donato. But you know, and I found like a book for the Bosch family that lives in White River.
Yes.
But I mean, it's very kind of sparse. I'm wondering, do you have any recommendations on books that I could
yes. Wade,
research?
you're welcome to contact me on my email address that will be provided at the end. I will refer you to the book by Wilma Kruse. Although it was published in the early 1990s, it still remains valid. And then Wendy Gerst's more recent book, which deals with the studio potteries of South Africa. There are also a few additional publications dealing with more contemporary South African ceramics. Happily, we'll share that with you. So if you can contact me by email, I'll give you all those details.
I would be happy to. And the other thing too is I just finished visiting the Gardner Museum, and they have a lovely exhibit, and they have a few examples of Innu art, ceramic Innu art, modern. There are efforts being made, but it is deplorable that these efforts are few and far between. There's more in the Mesoamerican section than there is in the Canadian section when you go to the Gardner, just as an observation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Thanks, Wade. Amy?
We had a question in here about, I had a little problem hearing some things. Did you mention firing techniques and traditions? Is there anything individual about the kilns and traditions? Are they using specific glazes which have cultural identity? That's from Malcolm Dixon, and I don't think we answered that. So I'm just bringing that question up.
No, we don't. And I will immediately confess that I'm not familiar sufficiently familiar with the topic to be able to answer that. I don't know.
Ronnie,
If Kim can answer.
Yeah, and what's actually very interesting that Jabunala, our national living treasure, has agreed to run some classes at our new center and teach people traditional Zulu techniques and bring clay from KwaZulu. And I think this is going to be a huge thing. And I'm really excited. But traditionally, in traditional Zulu ceramics, there are no glazes. Okay, and the pots are fired in an indentation in the ground, and the coals are put there, and then the pots actually fired on a little tripod with legs. And I've got some really beautiful images of these processes. If anybody would like me to email them to them, I've been documenting this since the 90s.
Great.
But the pots are very quick. They put coals into the insides of the pots to dry all the moisture out. And then the pots are actually fired in half an hour, which is quite extraordinary. But they only fire when the ground is dry. So if there's been rain, they would never fire. So it's really interesting. But there's no glazing done in these traditional techniques. And the contemporary ceramicists use kilns and glazes and slips and engobes and things like that. I'm not sure if I've answered adequately.
Okay, thanks, Kim.
It's a pleasure.
Deborah?
I see there has been no more questions, but there is one notice here that Ronnie's research will be published alongside that of scholars from other parts of Africa in the forthcoming book, Exploring Visual Cultures of Africa, Waxman 2022. And I thank you, Ronnie, for your inspiring contribution. So that's advertising that. I think, I don't know if there's any more comments on this really interesting and fraught.
Wendy has a question.
Thing. So let's get Amy going.
Deborah. Go ahead, Wendy.
Thank you. Is that okay if I have another comment? Sorry, I don't want to dominate. I think, kind of going back to Ronnie's question and this notion of hybridity, for me as a curator looking internationally at and focusing on both contemporary Canadian and contemporary African or Southern African ceramics, what I see as the productive bridge between the two and what I personally see as the most exciting developments is ceramic artists who are taking the responsibility of being knowledge bearers and using their knowledge, not just of their craft, but their understanding and their location within their respective cultures, within their clans and within their families and within their villages to be leaders and to build their communities. And that for me is really exciting. So whether it's Andile Diovani, and then I will also just flag Casey Adams, who's based in Winnipeg, Canada. For me, those are the most exciting artists coming out of the contemporary ceramic scenes, not because their work is wow, but because they've gone beyond making wow work and they're building communities.
Our talk at Iziko will be one
point.
of the artists we're talking about is Casey Adams. So she's a very important person in Canada for sure.
Yes, so brilliant. So that's just really what I want to say. Like, I think aesthetics is super important, but we've like neglected community and ceramic artists by virtue in many instances of ancestral knowledge, or Andile speaks about dreaming, Casey Adams speaks about dreaming. They're deeply connected with their ancestors on multiple levels and are renegotiating new identities, but in the process giving back and building communities, and that is just so exciting.
Yeah. I agree.
Very true.
So what Wendy said is so valid that ceramics is a good piece of ceramic work is not about the wow. Not for me. It's not the aesthetics. It is what does it communicate? How does it trigger thinking in me? And if it triggers thinking in you, how can the two of us communicate then? And I think that is what contemporary South African ceramics it presents that opportunity, and that's to enter in discussion with one another and with the outside world. It's a bridge, and I can venture onto that bridge only when I understand more than the superficial.
Yeah.
We can talk for days about this.
Thanks. A lifetime.
I think it's great, a great conversation.
Yeah.
Thanks,
think
Kim,
it's
and I'd love to
fantastic.
continue this discussion when I come to South Africa.
Ronnie, I
sometime
want
this
you to
year.
come and talk. We've got a forum now. We need you to come talk.
And,
We'll put you in a king's Yoruba beaded chair, and you will sit there and you will converse and share your wisdom and your conversation.
good, as long as you have endless pots of tea to give to me.
Unequivocally, you know that it's there.
Thank you, Kim.
That's okay, Ronnie. Have a beautiful day.
And
Thank you
you.
all.
Thank you. Love
Thank
to
you
you.
so much. Yeah, likewise.
Thanks, Anne. Thanks, Wendy.
So are there any more questions or comments that anybody wishes to address to Ronnie? And if not, you can communicate to him through email. You can sign up for emails or notifications from the Northwest Ceramics Foundation if you're interested in our next few speakers. And it's just been wonderful that people have from all over the world have attended this. It's been a fantastic conversation, so informative, so much to think about. And it's so interesting to find these parallels, even though they're not exactly the same, but there still are these mutual experiences that we have with multiculturalism and indigenous and all that kind of problematic and challenging, yet very, I think, in the future, a very exciting way of being together and a way of communicating. So I hope that as time comes, we will all build bridges, which is what we've been really talking about. So thank you, Ronnie, so very, very much.
Thank you.
Terrific. And it is recorded. If you want to revisit this, it will be on our website. So I think
I look forward to assisting anyone. If you want to correspond by email, you're most welcome, and I'll try and assist as far as I can. Thank you again for the invitation, and thank you for everyone's participation. I'm particularly pleased to see that the South Africans joined us in. Baie dankie mense, just in Afrikaans, thank you. En ek verlang na julle. I miss you.
all right.
Thank you very much,
Ronnie.
baby.
We'll close the meeting. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Ciao.